Molly Tambor holds a PhD in Modern European History from Columbia University and specializes in political history and the history of women and gender. She is Associate Professor of History at Long Island University in New York and Visiting Professor in Global Governance at the University of Toronto, Vergata. Her current research is on the entry of women into police forces in modern democratic states, and her contribution is on this theme, and the title is Policing Women, How Women Entered the Italian Police Force.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, let's hope we don't have any more of that feedback. I just want to thank you all for still being here. What stamina you're showing. And I have learned so much today. I want to rewrite my presentation, but I'll give you what I brought. So, after the First World War, Italian police were militarized. After a reform debate that had originally concentrated an emphasis on improving community relations and social assistance, including the inclusion of women, which was happening in other countries after the First World War, particularly in England, but which ultimately went in quite a different direction, obviously, through this militarization. But after the Second World War, reform was revisited with an emphasis this time on democratization and influenced by Anglo-American desires, anti-fascist ideals, and women's now political and labor participation. A women's police was created, the Polizia Femminile. So I'm interested in asking how this form of women's work enforces, challenges, or subverts who can claim social control in post-war society, because ultimately that's what policing is, the claim to social control. So I call these women policing women because they are both women who earned new rights and opportunities for themselves as policing women, but it was at the cost of disciplining often the sexuality of their fellow women in ways that suggest that women's professionalization was part of a complicated and highly gendered social bargain, right? So in order to become policing women, you have to be police women. So this is a story that begins with a strong international context, influenced by the famous London Metropolitan Police, inspired by Robert Peel, but more directly influenced by the London Metropolitan Police because the first women to serve in the police in Italy served here in Trieste under the Allied military government. And the two colonels who were responsible for the Divisione Uniforme, which the Polizia Femminile was under the command of, were both former London policemen themselves before their military careers. And so they very much used their own model in creating the Polizia Civile for men and women, but particularly insisted that there be women who served. So we have, right away I'd like you to notice that when we see these women, the uniforms were always a really important point of debate because women who wanted to serve in the police insisted that they should wear uniforms. They wanted to differentiate themselves from social workers. They wanted rank, they wanted professionality, they wanted salary, they wanted to carry arms. But the pushback was always that then these uniforms had to appear respectable and feminine. So high heels, skirts, and the pistol had to be in a borchetta. What have I done? Oh, okay. So this Polizia Femminile here in Trieste, the women served from 1947 to 1959 in a story that I'm discovering is highly complicated. I think Julia's point about 1954 being especially fraught is very key here. But they were eventually brought into the Polizia Femminile that was formed in the Repubblica Italiana as a result of the passage of the Legge Merlin. So part of the Merlin law, which is the law that deregulated prostitution and closed the state-run brothels in Italy, was that the vice squad, the Polizia di Buon Costume, be abolished, and that instead there be women police officers recruited and trained specifically for helping prostitutes out of the life, out of the brothels. So I just want to sort of show you a little snapshot of this moment of contention of creating this force. This is a 1958 memo from the Director General of the Police, Giovanni Cascatera, to the Minister of the Interior, that was later circulated to the forces of the Pubblica Sicurezza. He said that the lady senator's law was probably inevitably going to pass, and therefore the police had to figure out what to do about prostitutes and what to do about women as police officers. He rejected any suggestion that women were appropriate officer material. He noted in particular, right, that you cannot take a respectable woman and put her into this non-respectable environment. He simply didn't think that it would work. But he would fail, because Maria Pia del Canton successfully passed a second law that instituted the Polizia Femminile as required by the Merlin law. This was law number 1083 of 1959. And the first class would enter service in 1961. There they go. In the end, Cascatera had to resign himself to the creation of this corps, since to oppose it would be to invite the charge of unconstitutional discrimination against hiring women, which has also been explained to us already today, wonderfully. And he also felt that this would bring unwelcome meddling in the police force from bureaucrats and politicians. So he ended up deciding to defend the aspiring female officers' demands for professional training, bearing arms, wearing uniforms, and having rank discipline as colleagues rather than assistants to male officers. That is, the police chose to extend their own discretion and autonomy to women officers rather than lose it for themselves. But the main concerns that he discussed, I think, are revealing. He remarked that the law would not solve the problem of prostitution, since such women were permanently deviant and could not be integrated into normal society. He entertained first a wishful proposal to sequester women as they exited the brothels and place them in state-run dormitories. But he acknowledged that probably no one would want this in their own communities. So then he proposed that perhaps these women could be sent to Ustica, which is one of the islands where Mussolini had exiled political prisoners and prisoners of war and convicted homosexuals to internal exile under fascism. So Cascatera admitted that this too was probably not very likely under the new democratic government. And this new parliament that was now operating with 45 women members for the first time in history had already worked particularly intensely on implementing women's rights, so that, among other things, the police could no longer legally force any citizens to undergo medical checks, which was a procedure that had been used in the past to harass and surveil suspected and registered prostitutes, nor could anyone be put under surveillance or house arrest for moral discipline. So Cascatera landed finally on the order that all prostitutes could still be legally surveilled and kept under control by making women police officers the main enforcers of the 1956 Public Safety Law, which contains a provision for the full UDV Act, which is an expulsion or deportation warning. This is in order to return to your place of original residence, to remain within the confines of one's hometown for 2 or 3 years, and it can be served without the subjects having been tried for or convicted of any crime. So this way, lists of known prostitutes and other deviants could be shared from arresting officers to local officers, and the subjects in question could be supervised more or less permanently. And indeed, by 1961, this is what happened. Records appear to show that stops and arrests performed by the Polizia Femminile were predominantly of prostitutes, and to some extent also homosexuals and what were called then transvestites, who then became subject to police registration, surveillance, and house arrest. This was a paradox in which women, considered best suited for the social work, non-criminal side of law enforcement, were tasked with searching for and rooting out the aspects of society considered most deviant, obscene, and inappropriate for women. So they thus found themselves ultimately thrown in with, yet pitted against, juvenile delinquents, prostitutes, homosexuals, trans people, and by the 1980s and 1990s, dealing with the transformations brought in these populations by rising immigration. How do they reconcile their own non-normative gender choices with the discipline and punishment of the transgressions of other marginalized groups? This central paradox that dogged women's professionalization in policing, right? To enter, women and other police reformers emphasized the ways in which female police officers would reinforce natural and proper and respectable sex roles in society and prevent perversion and vice, but to serve, women officers necessarily engaged with exactly those persons and behaviors deemed less decent. So the job required a set of professional activities in which the officers themselves prevented a threatening and potentially subversive performance of gender, disrupting the masculinity of cop culture, entering masculine spaces, displaying characteristics of physical strength and courage, lack sensitivity to danger, investigative cunning, comfort with weapons, and open ambition for arrests, solves, and promotions. So there's two major strands of argument that I want to follow with this project. The first is that women's entry into policing became acceptable only when their image of respectable and normative femininity helped the entire Italian police force look more accountable to a democratic populace as public servants, not fascist enforcers of state violence. But that this process couldn't begin until prostitutes were no longer a protected group under the state. I don't think police officers could be protected women by the state until prostitutes weren't. So that's why I don't think it happened before 1958, even though it was a post-war process, because Merlin proposed the Merlin Law in 1948. It just didn't pass until 1958. Okay, and this process reached its culmination in 1981 with the police reform that not only finally integrated women into the Polizia di Stato, but also demilitarized the police and allowed officers to organize a union and gain democratic representation. So the first integrated class of officers entered service in 1983, although you'll notice these uniforms are still not entirely androgynous. And the dress uniform is still a skirt and heels. The second is that despite this reassuring public message that women bring democratization and reform to the police, there's actually a very disruptive gender struggle within the culture of the police and between the police and the public. In the post-war, women's entry into the public spheres of the workplace and of politics brought along the gender threat of women asserting social control. And so studying this reveals to us who was liberated and threatened by such changes, and this conflict is by no means over.